The rain hammered Little Italy's cobblestones like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 broken dreams. In the narrow alley behind Benedetti's bakery, a small figure huddled against the brick wall, clutching a stolen loaf to his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Tommy Castellano was 8 years old, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had seen too much. His clothes, 3 sizes too large and patched with scraps of different fabrics, hung on his skeletal frame like mourning shrouds. The bread pressed against his ribs, still warm from the oven, was the first real meal he'd had for days. "Please, God," he whispered into the storm, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "Just let me eat this one piece." But God, it seemed, had other plans. Heavy footsteps echoed through the alley, splashing through puddles that reflected the amber glow of the street lamps. Tommy's heart hammered against his chest as 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their dark overcoats billowing like the wings of carrion birds. "Well, well," sneered Vincent the Hammer Rossini, his scarred face twisted into a grotesque smile. "What have we got here? A little rat stealing from honest working people." Tommy tried to run, but his bare feet slipped on the wet stones. He crashed hard, the bread tumbling from his grasp and landing in a dirty puddle. His stomach clenched with a pain sharper than any physical blow. "You know what we do to thieves around here, boy?" The Hammer's voice was silk wrapped around razor wire. The other 2 men, built like brick walls with hands the size of dinner plates, grabbed Tommy's arms and hauled him to his feet. Their grip was iron, crushing, designed to leave marks that would last for weeks. "I'm sorry," Tommy sobbed, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "I'm so hungry. My mama, she's sick, and we ain't got nothing to eat." "Excuses," spat the Hammer, rolling up his sleeves to reveal arms covered in crude tattoos. "Your mama should have taught you better." The first blow caught Tommy across the jaw, snapping his head to the side with a sickening crack. Stars exploded behind his eyelids, and he tasted copper on his tongue. The second punch drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish pulled from water. "Please," he whispered, but the word was lost in the storm. That's when the footsteps stopped. A new presence filled the alley, one that made even the Hammer pause mid-swing. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and the very air grew thick, with an authority that needed no introduction. "Vincent," the single word, spoken in a voice like aged whiskey and cigarette smoke, carried more power than a dozen threats. The Hammer's hand froze in midair, his face draining of color faster than water through a sieve. Don Salvatore Torino stepped into the pale circle of lamplight, his presence commanding attention from every shadow. He was not a large man, but he filled the space around him with an intensity that made giants seem small. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the rain, and his dark suit, worth more than most men made in a year, remained somehow untouched by the storm. "Don Torino," the Hammer stammered, releasing Tommy so quickly the boy nearly collapsed. "We were just, handling some business." The Don's eyes, black as midnight and twice as deep, moved slowly from the Hammer to Tommy. The boy found himself caught in that gaze, unable to look away, unable to breathe. He had heard the stories, whispered in doorways and spoken in hushed tones round kitchen tables. Don Salvatore Torino, the most powerful man in Little Italy, the king of the streets, the man who could order a death with a nod and grant salvation with a smile. What business? The Don's voice remained calm, conversational, but Tommy could feel the dangerous current running beneath the surface. "The kid. He stole bread from Benedetti's. We were just teaching him a lesson about respect." The Don walked closer, his footsteps silent despite the wet pavement. He knelt beside Tommy, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Up close, Tommy could see the lines round the Don's eyes, the silver stubble on his jaw, the gold tooth that glinted when he spoke. "Is this true, boy? You took bread without paying?" Tommy nodded, unable to find his voice. Fresh tears started down his cheeks, mixing with the rain and blood from his split lip. "And why did you take it?" "My mama," Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. "She ain't eaten in 3 days. She's got the fever, and she can't work. And the landlord, he's gonna throw us out if we don't pay. And I just wanted to bring her something, anything, so she wouldn't hurt so much." The Don listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Tommy finished, silence fell over the alley like a burial shroud. Even the rain seemed to quiet, waiting for judgment. Slowly, the Don reached into his coat. The hammer and his men tensed, but instead of a gun, the Don withdrew a pristine white handkerchief. He dabbed gently at the blood on Tommy's face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You know what I see when I look at you, boy." Tommy shook his head, afraid to speak. "I see myself 40 years ago, hungry, desperate, willing to do anything to survive." The Don's eyes grew distant, as if seeing ghosts from his past. "I see a son who loves his mother more than he fears pain." The Don stood, his presence somehow growing larger, more imposing. He turned to face the hammer, and Tommy watched as the color drained completely from the enforcer's face. "You want to teach lessons about respect, Vincent? Let me teach you one." What happened next would become legend in the streets of Little Italy. The Don's voice dropped to a whisper, but every word cut through the air like a blade through silk. "This boy, under my protection now. Anyone who touches him, anyone who even looks at him wrong, answers to me personally. You understand?" The hammer nodded so vigorously Tommy thought his head might fall off. "Furthermore," the Don continued, "you will personally deliver a basket of food to his mother every day until she is well. You will pay their rent for the next 6 months, and you will apologize to this boy for laying hands on him." "But Don Torino," the Don raised one finger, and the hammer's protests died in his throat. Now, the hammer dropped to his knees in the filthy alley water, his expensive suit soaking up mud and grime. "I'm sorry, kid, real sorry. Won't happen again, I swear on my mother's grave." The Don turned back to Tommy, who was watching the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. The most feared man in the neighborhood was on his knees, apologizing to him. "Come here, boy." Tommy approached on shaking legs. The Don placed his hands on the boy's shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. "What's your name?" "Tommy Castellano, sir." "Well, Tommy Castellano, you showed courage tonight. Stupid courage, maybe, but courage nonetheless." The Don's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "In my world, we value loyalty above all else, loyalty to family. You proved yours tonight." The Don leaned down and kissed Tommy's forehead, a gesture so unexpected, so tender, that the boy's tears began flowing again. "No one will touch you again, Tommy. You have my word." As if summoned by magic, a black Cadillac appeared at the mouth of the alley. The Don straightened his tie, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, and began walking toward his car. "Vincent," he called without turning around, "see that Mrs. Castellano gets the best doctor in the city tonight." The Don paused at the car door and looked back at Tommy one final time. "Remember this night, boy. Remember that sometimes when the world seems darkest, salvation can come from the most unexpected places." The Cadillac disappeared into the rain and darkness, leaving Tommy alone with the hammer and his men. But everything had changed. The boy who had been beaten and broken just minutes before now stood under the protection of the most powerful man in Little Italy. As Tommy walked home through the storm, his small hand clutching a $20 bill the Don had pressed into his palm, he carried with him more than money. He carried hope, and somewhere in his young heart, a seed of loyalty was planted that would grow and change everything. The rain continued to fall, but for Tommy Castellano, the storm had passed. 5 years had passed since that night in the alley, and Tommy Castellano had grown from a starving waif into a lean, sharp-eyed teenager. The streets of Little Italy had become his classroom, and Don Torino his most demanding teacher. At 13, Tommy knew things that would make grown men wake up screaming. The morning sun filtered through the smoke-stained windows of Torino's social club, casting long shadows across the poker table where Tommy sat counting money. His fingers moved with practiced precision, separating the bills into neat stacks while his ears stayed tuned to every conversation in the room. "The Irish are getting bold," muttered Frankie Three Fingers Marconi, dealing another hand. "They hit 2 of our numbers runners last week." Don Torino, now in his 70s, but still commanding absolute respect, sat in his leather chair like a king on his throne. His hair had gone completely white, and liver spots dotted his hands, but his eyes remained as sharp as broken glass. "Let them come," the Don said quietly, lighting his morning cigar. "Tommy, what do you think we should do about the Irish problem?" All eyes turned to the boy. This was Tommy's test, one of many the Don had given him over the years. The old man believed in education through experience, and every question was a lesson wrapped in danger. Tommy finished counting the last stack before looking up. "They're testing us, Don Torino. They want to see if we'll fight back or roll over like dogs, and we make an example, but not the one they expect." The Don's eyebrows raised slightly. "Explain." Tommy stood, walking to the window that overlooked Mulberry Street. Down below, children played stickball in the same alleys where he'd once begged for scraps. "They hit our runners, so they expect us to hit theirs. That starts a war that bleeds everyone dry. Instead, we hit their boss's daughter's wedding next week. Not violently," Tommy added quickly, seeing the concern in the Don's eyes. "We make sure every vendor cancels. The flowers don't arrive. The band gets food poisoning. The cake falls apart. We embarrass him in front of his entire family and the other families." The room fell silent. Frankie stopped dealing cards, even the Don's cigar smoke seemed to pause in the air. "He loses face," the Don said slowly. "His own people start questioning his strength. And then," Tommy continued, "we send him a wedding gift, a beautiful basket of bread, with a note that says, 'From the Torino family with respect.'" The Don began to smile, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "The boy thinks like a true Don already." That afternoon, Tommy walked through the neighborhood, noting everything: which shops were thriving, which families looked hungry, who needed help and who might cause trouble. This was his territory now, or would be someday, and he took his responsibilities seriously. He stopped outside the old Benedetti's bakery, the same place where he'd stolen that loaf of bread years ago. The owner, an elderly man with flour permanently embedded under his fingernails, saw Tommy through the window and waved. "Tommy, come in, come in." The bell above the door chimed as Tommy entered. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled his nostrils, triggering memories of hunger so deep it made his stomach clench with phantom pain. "Mr. Benedetti, how's business?" "Good, good. Thanks to the Don, I don't worry about protection anymore. And you've grown so tall. Your mother, she must be proud." Tommy's expression darkened at the mention of his mother. She had died 2 winters ago, her lungs finally giving out after years of sickness. The Don had paid for the funeral, the best Little Italy had ever seen. But no amount of money could fill the hole in Tommy's heart. "She would be," Tommy said quietly. That evening, Tommy sat in his small apartment above Torino's restaurant, reading. By lamplight, the Don insisted on education, both street smart and book smart. "A leader without learning is just a thug with power," the old man always said. A soft knock interrupted his studies. Tommy opened the door to find Maria Torino, the Don's granddaughter, standing in the hallway with a plate of food. "Nana said you missed dinner again," she said, pushing past him into the apartment. Maria was 16, with dark hair that caught the light like silk and eyes that seemed to see straight through. To a person's soul, she was also completely off limits, something that Don had made clear without ever saying the words directly. "You worry too much," Tommy said, taking the plate gratefully. "Someone has to. You're so busy trying to impress my grandfather that you forget to take care of yourself." She sat on his only chair while he ate standing up, watching him with the intensity that ran in her family. "Tommy, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever think about leaving? About what life might be like outside all this?" The question caught him off guard. In 5 years, the thought had never seriously crossed his mind. The Don had saved him, given him purpose, made him family. Leaving would be like cutting off his own arm. "Where would I go? This is my home. These are my people. But what if you could have something else, something normal?" Tommy set down his fork, studying her face. "Is that what you want? Something normal?" Maria's cheeks flushed pink. "Sometimes. Don't you wonder what it would be like to walk down the street without people being afraid? To have friends who aren't connected? To choose your own path?" Before Tommy could answer, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maria jumped up, smoothing her skirt, as the Don himself appeared in the doorway. "Maria," the old man said, his voice carrying a warning, "your grandmother is looking for you." "Yes, Nano." She kissed Tommy's cheek quickly and whispered, "Think about what I said." After she left, the Don entered and closed the door behind him. He moved slowly to the window, looking out at the street that had been his kingdom for 40 years. "She's a good girl," he said finally. "Yes, sir, too good for this life, too good for you." The words stung, but Tommy knew they weren't meant cruelly. The Don was simply stating facts, the way he always did. "I know, Don Torino, do you? Because I see the way you look at her, the way she looks at you." The Don turned from the window. "Love is a luxury men like us can't afford, Tommy. It makes us weak. It gives our enemies targets." Tommy nodded. Though something inside him rebelled against the words, the Don studied him for a long moment, then sat heavily in the chair Maria had vacated. "There's something I need to tell you, something that will change everything." Tommy's blood went cold. He'd heard that tone before, always before bad news. "The commission has been asking questions about you, about your future role in our family. Some of the other Dons think you're too young, too untested. I'll prove myself. Whatever you need me to do." The Don held up a weathered hand. "There's going to be a test, a big one, and if you fail," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "If you're enjoying Tommy's story and wanted to help us continue bringing you these emotional tales, please subscribe to support our production costs." The next morning brought news that would test everything Tommy had learned. Vincent the Hammer, Rossini, the same man who had beaten him in that alley years ago, had been found dead in his car. 3 bullets in the back of his head. The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and lies. Vincent Rossini lay in his expensive casket, looking more peaceful in death than he ever had in life, while his widow sobbed dramatically in the front row. Tommy stood with the other members of the Torino family, his black suit making him look older than his 13 years. But Tommy wasn't mourning the Hammer. He was watching. Every face, every gesture, every whispered conversation was a piece of a puzzle he needed to solve. Someone had killed Rossini, and the smart money said it was either the Irish or a rival family, making a move against Don Torino. What worried Tommy most was the timing. The hit had come just hours after the Don's warning about the commission and the test that was coming. In their world, there were no coincidences. "Terrible thing," murmured Sal Benedetto, sliding up beside Tommy. Sal was the Don's underboss, a man who smiled constantly and killed without hesitation. Vinny was getting careless. Should have known better than to meet with strangers. Tommy nodded but said nothing. The Don had taught him that listening often revealed more than asking questions. After the service, the family gathered at the restaurant for the traditional meal. Tommy helped serve, his eyes and ears open, cataloging every detail. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Joey the Fish Torino, the Don's nephew, was missing. Tommy slipped out through the kitchen and made his way to Joey's apartment 6 blocks away. The door was unlocked, always a bad sign in their neighborhood. Inside, furniture was overturned, and dark stains on the floor told a story. Tommy didn't want to read. He was examining the blood spatter when he heard the footsteps. 3 men entered through the back door, guns drawn, faces grim. Tommy recognized them as muscle for the Castellano family, rivals from Brooklyn. Well, said the largest one, a mountain of a man called Big Eddie. "Look what we caught." The Don's little pet. Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but Big Eddie's gun was already pointed at his chest. "I wouldn't. We got questions for you, boy." They tied him to a chair in Joey's kitchen, the same chair where Tommy had eaten Sunday dinners when the Don wanted to keep family business truly in the family. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Where's Joey?" Big Eddie asked, lighting a cigarette. "I don't know what you're talking about." The backhand came fast and hard, snapping Tommy's head to the side. Stars exploded behind his eyes. But he'd felt worse. The years of training with the Don's men had toughened him in ways that went beyond the physical. "Wrong answer. See, Joey came to us 3 days ago, said he had information about your old man's operations. said he was ready to make a deal. Tommy's heart sank. Joey had always been weak, always resentful that his uncle had chosen a street orphan over blood family for grooming. But betrayal was still betrayal, and betrayal was death. "We had a meeting set up for this morning," Big Eddie continued. "Joey never showed. Found his car burned out in Queens with enough blood to paint a house. So either your boss figured out Joey was talking, or Joey got cold feet and ran. Maybe he just realized what kind of scum he was dealing with," Tommy said. This time the punch came from the man to his left, catching him in the ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate. But Tommy had learned not to cry out. Showing weakness only made things worse. "Here's what's going to happen," Big Eddie said, blowing smoke in Tommy's face. "You're going to tell us everything Joey was going to tell us. Numbers, locations, protection routes, who's on the payroll, everything. And if I don't..." Big Eddie smiled, and Tommy saw his own death in that expression. "Then we start sending pieces of you back to the old man, starting with fingers and working our way up." Tommy closed his eyes and thought about that night in the alley, when the Don had kissed his forehead and promised no one would ever hurt him again. He thought about his mother, dead in a hospital bed she couldn't afford. He thought about Maria, and her dreams of a normal life. When he opened his eyes, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it was buried under layers of steel and ice that would have made the Don proud. "You want to know what Joey was going to tell you?" Tommy said quietly. Big Eddie leaned forward eagerly. "He was going to tell you that you're all dead men." The explosion came exactly on schedule. Tommy had noticed the gas leak when he'd first entered the apartment, a subtle hiss that most people would have ignored. But the Don had taught him to notice everything. And one of the things he'd noticed was a lit cigarette in an apartment full of gas. The blast threw everyone to the floor, shattering windows and bringing down part of the ceiling. In the chaos, Tommy managed to work one hand free from the ropes and grab the gun that Big Eddie had dropped. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the 3 men were dead, crushed by fallen beams. Big Eddie was alive, but bleeding from a dozen cuts. His left arm bent at an impossible angle. Tommy stood over him, the gun steady in his hands despite the ringing in his ears. "Please," Big Eddie whispered. "I got kids. So did the people you killed," Tommy replied. The shot echoed through the ruined apartment like a final judgment. Tommy was walking back to the restaurant when the police cars screamed past him, heading toward the explosion. He'd cleaned the blood from his face and straightened his clothes, but inside he was shaking. Not from fear, but from the realization of what he'd become. He found the Don in his private office, playing chess alone. The old man looked up when Tommy entered, taking in the boy's appearance with eyes that missed nothing. "Rough afternoon," the Don asked mildly. "The Castellanos had Joey. They wanted information. And now, they don't want anything anymore." The Don nodded and moved a chess piece. "Joey? I think he's dead. There was too much blood in his apartment. Family betrays family." The Don's voice carried no emotion, but Tommy could see the pain in his eyes. "It's the oldest story in our world." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the day settling between them like smoke. "Don Torino," Tommy said finally, "Maria asked me something yesterday about leaving this life, about choosing a different path." The Don's hand paused over a chess piece. "And what did you tell her?" "That this was my home. These were my people. And now, after today." Tommy thought about the moment when he'd pulled the trigger, about the finality of it, about the line he'd crossed that could never be uncrossed. "Now I know there's no going back. This is who I am." The Don smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of understanding and regret. "Then you're ready for your real test. Tomorrow night, there's a meeting with the heads of the other families. They're going to question your readiness, your loyalty, your right to eventually inherit what I've built." "What do I need to do?" The Don finally made his chess move, capturing Tommy's king in a move the boy hadn't seen coming. "You need to be yourself. The boy who stole bread to feed his mother. The man who just eliminated 3 enemies without breaking a sweat. The son I chose over my own blood." That night, Tommy stood on the fire escape outside his apartment, looking out over the lights of Little Italy. Somewhere below, Maria was probably dreaming of a normal life. Somewhere in Queens, families were mourning the men he'd killed, and Somewhere in his own heart, the last innocent part of Tommy Castellano finally died. He was 13 years old, and he was already more dangerous than most grown men. The Don had kept his promise. No one would ever hurt Tommy again, because now Tommy was the one others had to fear. The transformation was complete. The boy who had once begged for bread had become a man who could take whatever he wanted. And in the morning, he would sit at a table with the most powerful criminals in New York and prove that blood didn't always make family, but loyalty could make a king. The city slept, but Tommy Castellano's education was just beginning. Thank you for following Tommy's dark journey. If you enjoyed this story and wanted to help us create more compelling tales like this, please subscribe to support our production efforts. Your support keeps these stories alive.